I mean, it's interesting because when I think of legibility, I think of Kafka, and I think of Fanon, both at the same time. So to kind of say, what is it that allows us to be able to be seen and acknowledged, not in a good way or a bad way, but the mere fact of affirming that we exist to me is a reference to legibility. And so, I think of Kafka's story about being before the law, appearing before a gate every day in the hopes that the gate would open, and this man then ultimately saying, but it never opening. And that's part of, I think, the metaphor of legibility. Will someone actually acknowledge who you are? That
So, hello everybody. Thank you for joining us. Today, I have the absolute honor and pleasure of speaking with Professor Falguni Sheth. She is a professor of women's, gender, and sexuality studies at Emory University. Her publications include the book Toward a Political Philosophy of Race, and more recently, another book called Unruly Women, Race, Neoliberalism, and the Hijab. Her scholarly interests include postcolonial theory, transnational feminist studies, critical philosophy of race and race studies, feminist political theory, anticolonial and empire studies, as well as political and legal philosophy. And something I discovered in your work that I find really exciting is your case studies, your legal case studies, which we could maybe compare with psychoanalytic case studies that reveal what is going on underneath, beneath the surface. So
mm-hmm.
thank you so much for joining me, first of all,
My
Professor
pleasure.
Sheth.
Thank you. It's my honor.
And maybe as my first question, I could ask you about be an overview, a general overview of your approach, your work, how it is situated within these broader fields of postcolonial theory, feminist studies, critical philosophy, and how do these coordinates define your work?
Thank you. That's such a rich and generative question. It's also very complicated. I would say it's more recently, let's say over the last 10 years, I've started to think of myself as somebody who works in critical feminist security studies, which is not really a widely known field. It's very specific, and I think it's something that has become much more popular um, after 9/11 in the US, where many of us were really concerned about the kinds of frameworks and applications that were being used to think about some of the criminalized categories that emerged. So terrorist, and obviously Muslims for a while became synonymous with the notion of terrorist and criminals, and I was extremely disturbed about that. And I felt that my education and philosophy hadn't really prepared me to dissect those categories, even though I was extremely interested in dissecting those categories and felt that I would be and thought that I would be able to do it, but not through kind of traditional tools. And so part of the method, if you will, I mean, I am trained as a I'm trained as someone who studies European philosophy, known as continental philosophy, in various circles. Um, you know, and there is something incredibly rich about that background. So to be able to kind of study 18th, 19th, 20th century European philosophers and to think about what they consider to be really important. So, in the tradition of critical theory, to think about culture, to think about psychology, to think about capitalism. So, those were really helpful, right? So, Adorno, Horkheimer, Benjamin. I was also very taken with Hannah Arendt and her approach to thinking about race in the aftermath of the Holocaust. And so those were really helpful. I also, in the first book, in the philosophy of race book, I do also take on some frameworks that I think are helpful but also problematic from Derrida and Benjamin and Agamben. And part of my interest was in saying, well, why do we make assumptions about what's random and what are random events of justice and what are intentional. Because in The Force of Law for Derrida, one of the points that he makes is that justice is often quite random and incalculable. And I took issue with that because it seemed to me that justice is actually almost never random. And it appears random when we don't agree with the outcome, but it's not random, and that there is something very protective of various elite populations. And with Agamben, again, the randomness of the outsider, of the exception, seemed to be less than random to me from where I was standing. And part of the approach then is to kind of think, which these critical theorists often do, and Foucault, of course, also does in very interesting, sometimes controversial, sometimes objectionable ways, to think about history and a so-called understanding of genealogy, which in the Foucauldian sense does not mean just a pure history, but a kind of reassembling different kinds of, if you will, archives and data points to see what kind of stories that they tell. So to move away from the chronological and rather to think about certain kinds of important critical nodes. So I thought those were really helpful tools, but I think the other thing that I was very interested in doing was to borrow from non-philosophical fields, if you will, so the social sciences, where often there is, well, not in economics per se, but in history, in sociology, and in anthropology, things that have now we're very familiar with, but actually thinking about the events themselves, thinking about data points themselves, thinking about populations, and to begin the process of philosophizing from the concrete. And many philosophers now do that work. But there weren't that many, I think, not as many 30 years ago when I was first working in this. I mean, W.E.B. Du Bois, certainly, Alain Locke, many of folks in the African American philosophical tradition who were not considered philosophers do this work, right? To begin with the concrete. But in my case, it seemed to be very helpful to borrow that approach in order to, first of all, move away from one of the most objectionable aspects of philosophy, which is the assumption to universalism. And instead to say, how can we start with the particular? And how can we work with a certain kind of inductive reasoning to think about what the general application was? So to move from the particular to the general allowed me to still think in broader terms without insisting that various conclusions had to be universal, but rather thinking generally in certain contexts, these kinds of conclusions were helpful. So that was part of what I used as my method, as my approach. And then, I didn't, when I got my PhD, even though there was a lot of work on race at my institution, um, race was really considered in regard to the European context rather than the US context. And so I had to do a lot of reading even after I finished my PhD, especially after I finished my PhD and started coming across the work of various folks who are now considered to be critical race theorists. And now there's a whole new field called critical philosophy of race. I think it's a way of distinguishing from a certain kind of less critical field called philosophy of race. So those were extremely helpful, most notably the work of Charles Mills um, and others, Lewis Gordon, but also in the law schools. At that time, critical race theory was emerged as a certain kind of legal critical doctrine to push back against the same kind of analytic natural law applications, even pragmatist applications that were being pushed by legal scholars through the centuries that were really also working against different kinds of marginalized populations who were not accounted for and were rather invisible. So a little long-winded, but
No, no, perfect. Usually, when students are introduced to philosophy as a discipline, critical thinking is a big part of that introduction. Official, like the title of "We are going to learn to think critically." But there is this field of critical philosophy. So if a student asks you about what is achieved through critical philosophy, what is maybe especially critical about critical philosophy? How would you begin to introduce that? Like, how is it more critical than philosophy itself? So, my initial question was to just ask you about what critical philosophy and why critical philosophy.
So, who do you have in mind when you think of critical philosophy? Maybe that's the beginning of my answer. I mean, because I think of critical theory more than critical philosophy. Is that what you have in mind, or do you have someone else in mind?
I have people like Du Bois, feminist philosophers, people who identify the way you describe it, beginning with particular situations, that the undeniable aspects of particular situations, as opposed to the armchair,
Mhm.
because we can the way we use that word critical thinking, we could the place of it maybe is different. We can begin thinking critically from the armchair, or we could begin from the world or a conflict.
I think an overlap, that's a really helpful answer. Thank you. I mean, I think an overlap between kind of critical thinking in conventional terms and critical philosophy, is this sense of, well, what is not being covered, right? To kind of think about the ways in which that which appears to be universally true is in fact problematic when you break it down and examine it. So, I mean, I think that is certainly an overlap, right? Because at least, in critical thinking classes, when, you spend a lot of time teaching about logical fallacies and critical fallacies and the difference between belief and knowledge. But I think in critical philosophy, part of the approach is also it's larger than that, and to say, well, and we certainly see this burgeoning today with the introduction of feminist epistemologists of race, people who write about epistemic oppression. How do we know the difference between belief and knowledge? Is it really as simple as a kind of logic problem, right? Or does it also have to do with culture, history, ethics, backgrounds? And thinking about the contingencies, which are, I think, in any number of cases could be dismissed as just, oh, the exception. Oh, this is just a one-off. And I certainly think that's true even, in the field of political philosophy. To kind of, I mean, now I think the world has really radically changed in the last 10 years, but for the longest time to kind of say, well, and Dr. Mills talked about this in his work too, right? I mean, when he was looking at Rawlsian theory, he said, well, where are enslaved peoples in this writing? To the extent that they're mentioned, they're cast off as an exception, as something that's not relevant, as a blip in history. And that was often the response when you have political theory that doesn't seem to conform to history. It's like, oh, but that's not true. That's just a problem of the application. The theory is fine.
Mhm,
And so I think critical philosophy actually takes that on and says, actually, is it really that the theory is fine and the application is a problem, or is it that the application reveals to us the problem with the theory?
mhm,
And so that the theory itself then is really troubling in its implications. And I think that's what a lot of critical philosophers attempt to do, is to push back on what the realm of belief is. What are the boundaries of belief versus fact? And you see this, so beautifully in the last decade or so with the writings of philosophers like Christy Dotson, with others from in various kind of critical epistemologies, and also feminist political theorists, where there is this kind of this pushback to say, well, how do we know what is epistemology? How do we understand epistemology, and how do we really kind of why do we take for granted certain things as knowledge when they clearly don't apply to different kinds of groups and populations? So that's, I guess, how I would begin that
mhm.
class for that answer to the student.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So, I love the concepts that you use in your work, in your writing, to the extent that I've so far been studying some of your writing. One of them is the concept of the unruly, which is in the title of your 2022 book, but it also features in your first book on race. um, related to this concept of the unruly, the concept of ontopolitics, the concept of dismissal, the concept of excruciating, being positioned in such a way that the person has experience of ontologically subject to excruciation. Could you tell us about maybe beginning with the concept of the unruly, what this is, its significance, and what these concepts like the unruly reveal about our
Oh,
world?
yeah, sure. So, wow. So that, the thing is that the concept of the unruly has overlaps with so many other uses, or at least the way that I use it, the term has overlaps. For example, Nancy Fraser was really one of the first people to use the term unruly practices, and she is very much a kind of a radical socialist feminist political philosopher. But I think I'm using, and as we know in psychoanalysis and Lacan, there's also a certain understanding of, these kinds of signifiers, but I'm really using it initially as a kind of as a stand-in for the possibility of threat, of something that appears as threatening. And so I really wanted to leave that open as a signifier to say, well, many things could be threatening. They could be viewed as being defiant. And, the clearest, most vivid illustrations of this are, unfortunately, in this country, in the US, the history of the treatment of Black men um, within, post enslavement, and the ways in which their behaviors are viewed as extremely threatening or defiant. George Yancey, as a philosopher of race, really has many vivid examples of this. Even though that's not his term, but that's what I think of when I think initially of unruly. I also wanted to use it in a way that was larger than race. And to kind of think, or at least that was larger than about skin color, but to really think of it in relation to attitudes and comportments that were perceived as defiant or as deceived as uncooperative or not obeying various authorities or cultural norms or dominant rules, unspoken rules. And so it was really handy to kind of think of that term to apply to any number of things. So accents. Initially, I think I was writing in terms of thinking about how Muslim populations were being targeted by the state without actually being named. And so there were all kinds of um, secondary and tertiary signs that were being taken up as the unruly. So women who wore the hijab or the niqab, men who had beards, men who wore skull caps, right? And all kinds of visual, conspicuous religious symbols, but not necessarily across the board. So if you appeared European or white and you wore a Catholic habit, right, as nuns do, or if you wore a large cross, that was not seen as threatening or defiant because they were kind of symbols that folks were habituated to. But all of these others suddenly became they started to attract the attention of people who had not really been familiar with Muslims or other kinds of non-European cultures. And so they were read much like Black men and women and, often Black children are also read as being defiant and threatening. And so those things become the mark of that which has to be regulated. So that's how I turn to the idea of the unruly as being that which has to be regulated. It has to be addressed, but it also is a certain kind of strategic addressing to be able to claim plausible deniability that the practice or the regulation is racist, right? So to be able to sidestep that altogether. So that's how I began to articulate and theorize that term in the first book. And then, I think more generally in the second book, I do put it in the title. I've had misgivings about putting it in the title. because there are a number of other books that also have that same title, Unruly Women. Um, but the reason that I think it's helpful in the second book is because it's also again about thinking about not color specifically, although that can also be a part of the perceived threat, but about culture and about norms that, again, are very difficult to pinpoint because, as Uma Narayan has written about, culture is an extremely elusive category. And it appears to be a kind of totalizing category, but one can never name the entirety of a culture. One can only name certain kinds of practices within a culture. And those, if they're not language, they often pertain to certain kinds of practices, right? So sexual practices, gendered practices, marital practices, or clothing, or facial, um, you know, hair, or certain kinds of, outward manifestations. So they're not necessarily about biological skin or color, although, again, there can always be an augmentation of that.
Mhm.
So so that's why I think of this in those terms. And Unruly Women in the second book is really thinking about the ways in which North American women, specifically US women, who are Muslim, are often addressed by their employers. And because we have this very specific version of liberalism that intersects heavily with capitalism, the way that discrimination is articulated and addressed within the American juridical system is to insist that one has to show how discrimination has occurred. And was that discrimination something which um, could have been avoided without severe harm or loss of profit to the employer? I mean, it's a very specific, interesting, right, EEOC regulation. So that's how I started to kind of think about why is it that these women who are suing because they believe so strongly that they've been discriminated against, that they have to prove the very specific ways in which this discrimination could have been avoided without a loss to their employer. But underneath that, then, is also this sense of defiance. So a certain kind of implicit signification. How dare you? How dare you complain about this treatment? And that is not something which is really obvious when a suit is filed, but that becomes much more obvious when you read judicial opinions about how a case got adjudicated involving Muslim women who wear the veil or wear the niqab. And there are counterparts to that with regard to Muslim men as well. But that felt like an enormous scope, and so I just limited it to mostly employment discrimination cases.
Yeah, it's so helpful in revealing certain uh, uh, ways we conduct ourselves and each other at work. Like the example that comes to my mind is at my one of my workplaces recently. Uh, we had Muslim colleagues who, when company wanted to provide lunch, they needed halal options.
Mhm.
And the person in charge of coordinating lunch, they would have these reactions like, "Oh, that's like how inconvenient," or maybe a little bit more um, impactful is like celebrating Eid
Mhm.
as a Muslim. So this is like the person in that position has to suddenly be very brave and like strong and push back for their for continuing for the fact that they are practicing they eat halal food. So it suddenly becomes an issue, and unruliness maybe in its more innocent forms, it's like an inconvenience on other people. But personally, it makes me like I identified for a long time as an atheist, but I realized like when in that situation, I want to join that Muslim colleague and I want to go back and reconvert to Islam just for that purpose,
Right.
just so that that colleague is not alone in that situation, so we can push back the burden is shared, so we can both have less seriousness about it. Because aloneness is another issue in these scenarios. If you're less alone, we can have a sense of humor more easily about it. Like, but it's hard to have a sense of humor when you're like alone pushing back against the larger.
Yeah, it just feels much more grave when you're doing
Yes,
it by yourself, right?
yes.
That's true. And I think even the nature of these discrimination cases that I was looking at, they have to be vetted by the Equal, Opportunity Commission. So, that's actually in and of itself another vetting mechanism. Like it has to be so egregious that the EEOC agrees that this is a case that they will support as it goes up through the courts. Right? And if you try to sue or launch a case without their support, you will inevitably lose. But that's not always the case if you do it with their support. With you, often because they have so many cases that they have to wade through. I mean, isn't that interesting?
Mhm.
That, that they have to vet which cases they will actually lend their name to as serious evidence of discrimination. So even there, at the first stage, with a bureaucratic organization that is intended to be helpful, even there you have to prove how grave it is. And, if you're doing it alone, it's very, very difficult. I mean, I've seen a number of those cases in my research where they, lone plaintiffs tried to file cases and they were just dismissed in different ways, right? Either legally or technically or being mocked. So yeah, I think you're right. Like it's really hard. That's a big part of my kind of motivation to write about this, right? One does not have to be that in
Mhm.
order to see the problem.
Mhm. Mhm.
So,
Absolutely. You mentioned this dismissal. So I wanted to ask you about one of your recent articles, which is titled "Dismissal, Legibility, and the Normalizing of Colonial Misrecognition." And in this article, you employ a pair of concepts that I had never encountered before in this way, with this meaning: legibility and illegibility, which are related to recognition and misrecognition, but maybe slightly um, different. So what is revealed about the legal process, the juridical process, with when we pay attention to these concepts like eligibility?
I mean, it's interesting because when I think of legibility, I think of Kafka, and I think of Fanon, both at the same time. So to kind of say, what is it that allows us to be able to be seen and acknowledged, not in a good way or a bad way, but the mere fact of affirming that we exist to me is a reference to legibility. And so, I think of Kafka's story about being before the law, right? I'm forgetting all the details of the story, but appearing before a gate every day in the hopes that the gate would open, and this man then ultimately saying, but it never opening, and that's part of, I think, the metaphor of legibility. Will someone actually acknowledge who you are? That kind of legibility, I think, can be more popularly understood in the current moment with regard to um, folks who are trans, right? Like how does one insist, how can one successfully ask to be seen in a context where gender is binary or in a context where gender is insisted upon as being binary? How do you make that move to from birth certificates that assign a certain, sex at birth to a different kind of institutional identification, which is quite the hallmark of legibility, right? A passport, a driver's license. These are both things which affirm your existence and they confirm your existence, right? They have, for better or for worse, accepted legally that you have a certain kind of name, you have a certain kind of understanding, and that the institution recognizes that, right? So that's how I think of legibility. So illegibility then, I mean, yes, on one level is everything that is not that, but I also think illegibility is more complex because it doesn't necessarily mean that you're invisible, but rather that the aspects of you that you would like to have acknowledged are can be misconstrued, can be misread, and can be twisted into something that you don't think is properly associated with your existence. So it has a much larger, more complicated meaning, or, more layered meaning to be illegible. And so I think the struggle is all whether um, for folks who are trans or, sexually, have multiple kind of identity levels, for immigrants, for transnational folks, I think illegibility is very much just a part of our everyday life because the law recognizes simple identities much easily, even if they're inaccurate, right? So they can recognize you as Muslim and a terrorist. We would argue, right? We wouldn't that's those are most likely often inaccurate. And yet, that is a certain kind of illegibility because you are not being seen in the particular identification that you want the state to acknowledge.
So exactly, mislegibility. uh, in phenomenology, the task is to grasp things uh, as they are in the way that they are. So it is almost the other side of that. To be legible is it to strive to be perceived or recognized in the way that one is. To kind of like to remind the other of their phenomenological duty. Uh,
Yeah, I think that's right. Although I would, I'm now really starting to delve much more seriously into phenomenology. And as I'm reading all of this material, I'm also starting to see the ways in which there are assumptions of phenomenology which are really problematic about grasping things as they are, right? There's a kind of, at least in certain kinds of conventional thinkers, or older thinkers, right?
Mhm.
There is a certain assumption of accuracy, that there's a one-to-one correlation. And so the hermeneutical aspect of it seems to drop out altogether. It seems to be so obvious that, this is how you're going to present yourself in certain situations. And yet, one of the things that philosophers of race and feminist philosophers have been pointing out in other contexts for years is, we react very differently based on our bodily existence, right? Based on the perceptions of who we are. Fanon is one of the most popularly known philosophers to make that case. How is he received by a child in a supermarket, by his mother, right? And so the hermeneutical aspect, I think, really has to be developed phenomenologically as well, because I think that's what also helps us try to understand what legibility is.
Um, I also wanted to ask you about your recent article on Iris Marion Young. You connect her work, her life, her social status, and you point to the connections between what you just said about the phenomenologies. I think you implied that um, the phenomenological appeal to universal reason. So, writing about Iris Marion Young, you connect the 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 appeal to universal reason and respectability in her work and the certain boundaries that she did not transgress. Um, is respectability the opposite of unruly? I mean, sometimes to the extent that these are things that we can practice to some extent. Um, and in general, I wanted you to ask you about your reflections on Young and the thoughts that you pursue, the lines of thought that you pursue in that article.
Yeah, it's such an interesting question. I don't think I've thought about unruly and respectability as being opposites, but yeah, I totally see why you asked that question because I do think that if unruliness is perceived as defiance, or various aspects, gestures, comportment, um, that are just not conforming, then respectability, yeah. I mean, very much is about, well, from the perspective of the subject who is trying to be respectable, right? It's very much about conforming to try to become this one particular kind of subject in order to be respected and acknowledged. more than acknowledged, right? But really to be seen with a certain kind of dignity and reverence. So I do think, yeah, that's a very interesting contrast. On the other hand, I also think, respectability is something um, that is often held up as a standard in a way that unruliness is not, right? So unruliness is imposed on subjects, whereas respectability becomes a very elusive category. Can we be respectable? What do we have to do? Which powers that be do we have to please or appease in order to become respectable? Right. And so this is part of what I was trying to get at in Iris Young's writings is that, or at least in Justice and the Politics of Difference, which was the text that, where I talk about this. Um, and I think, you know, the respectability politics really emerges, as you know, if you've read the piece, like she's actually talking about some things that are very similar to what Audre Lorde was talking about. And, this comes out really beautifully in this essay in an edition edited by Melvin Rogers on African American intellectuals. I'm forgetting the citation. Jack, I believe his name is Jack. I'm forgetting Turner, something like that. Um, and Audre Lorde was the person who presided, who gave a keynote at this very famous conference on, Beauvoir and the Second Sex back in the 70s. Iris Young was in the audience. And, she has an epigraph of Audre Lorde's, but she doesn't actually go much further than that to talk about respectability and race and you know, and blackness or black women or the attitudes of white women towards black women. So race is something that even though for Iris Young is very much an important concept conceptually, again, the lack of application, right, to a very important thinker such as Audre Lorde is noticeable. And likewise, what we see is the kind of uptake of Iris Young's the citation of Iris Young by feminist philosophers, by political philosophers in the same context that Audre Lorde's work is not taken up as because she's a poet, she's a feminist, an activist, right? But she's also a thinker and she's also a writer, and yet that is not sufficient. And so it seems to me that there's also a kind of perpetuation of respectability politics based on who you cite, right? Are you citing the right people? Are you not omitting certain people to show who you are, right? And so, I mean, citational politics, which have actually also come up within the last decade, right? In the context of citing African American thinkers, Black women, right, women of color thinkers. This has become, this is really well acknowledged at this point, but who are you citing when you are trying to write a piece? And how much of that can be on the one hand, you just missed a bunch of writings, you just didn't know about them, or how much of it is, well, you understand that, but you know that your argument will get better, greater traction if you were citing scholars who are themselves respectable, right? And I think that's, so that is, yes, in a certain way, the opposite of the unruly, but it is the standard to which so many scholars are subject. Unruliness, right, is precisely the label that you get when you decide not to abide by those standards.
Mhm. Mhm. Yep. And being recognized as an artist, as somebody who's experimenting rather than doing serious scholarship.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. To
Um,
culture it down into a scientific framing,
I
right?
was, yeah, yeah. I was thinking about, I think you mentioned the trans issues and how in popular culture, a lot of times people are uh, arguing against transgender issues. They invoke science and scientific views, and Foucault's critique of the science of sexuality becomes relevant, and that stepping back in general, like this respectability of science as opposed to the humanities, is across the disciplines is still very strong. I think criteria of what is a respectable discipline, relatively speaking.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Um, um, I'd love to hear your thoughts about the connection between living a life and thinking. Is critical philosophy a practice, a form of life? And what does that mean to you? Because me, as I before recording, I talked about my own experiences as an immigrant who was pursuing an academic career. I really thought that I should separate my life, my form of life, and my scholarly pursuits. But more and more, the more, especially I discover thinkers like you, I start to question that distinction. So I'm very curious and interested to hear your ideas about how life and scholarship can be in dialogue or should be in dialogue. I remember you mentioning in an interview that you were preparing your first lecture as a tenure track professor, and 9/11 happened that morning, and
Mhm.
how that ended up being like an entanglement in your own life, how it shaped and informed your scholarship. So
Mhm.
again, sorry if it is a too general a question, but
No,
life.
no, no, it's not. It's
Yeah.
not at all too general a question. It's just a very, it's such a rich, robust question, and I'm trying to find a way to kind of answer it in a way that's not circuitous and all over the place. So that's the problem because it's a very good question. I mean, the pat answer is yes, right? One should really, if one can, try to bring these two together, especially if you have the incredible luxury of being an academic and a scholar. But I don't think that that's necessarily the case for many of us. I was very lucky. I had actually, and we've talked about this too, have thought about leaving philosophy from well before I finished my PhD. When I finished my PhD, I had a couple of adjunct gigs, and I was like, okay, once I finish this doctorate, I'm going to apply to law school. I'm going to become a lawyer because there's no future in this for me. And even my professors said the same thing because they didn't think I was very philosophical.
Wow.
So here I am, surprise, surprise, 30 years later, but not in a philosophy department. Um, but originally, the first 15 years I was teaching philosophy. But I think that it's really hard to to live that kind of life professionally and to think in terms of one's own experience. I mean, I think a lot it's perhaps more acceptable for the generation that comes after me. I notice it much more among the 30-year-olds and the 40-year-olds. And I think, for my generation, it was often more acceptable if you did it in a scientific way. You talked about the things that you wanted to talk about, but you did it abstractly. You did it in an organized and taxonomic way. And I also think, look, the intersections of academic freedom and capitalism are not very welcoming, right? Capitalism and the entire North American university terrain and their turn to grants, their turn to money to, first of all, subsidize your salary, to subsidize your leaves, to subsidize your teaching, to legitimate and validate your thinking, right? Suddenly creates a much more complex taxonomy between living a life of thinking and your own life because now it's not sufficient to say, well, this is how I'm thinking about things. You also have to articulate these things in a way that captures a larger scholarly judging authority's imagination, right?
Mhm.
And if you're doing something that's obscure, if you're doing something, again, the question of legibility, right? If you're doing something that people don't recognize, as acceptable. Like imagine, trying to get a grant to write about white supremacy 20 years ago, right? Done. I speak from experience. It doesn't happen. Maybe I wasn't very good at it. I'm fully willing to concede that. But you have to have categories. And, Weber talks about this in Science as a Vocation, that the whole practice of getting grants, of getting of getting money means that you are presenting your project to a group, a judging authority that recognizes your project and is putting a stamp on it so that it's already familiar, right? How do you communicate a project if it's not familiar? And actually, how do you do that successfully and are not met with skepticism? I mean, that's the big problem. And so I think those intersections are very hostile. I think they're very unwelcoming. There are certain things that one can get money for. And now what we're seeing is a complete repeal, right, of federal grants. And we see this not only are, I mean, which is the opposite of what I just said, that these things are familiar and extremely unwelcome. We don't want, right? The president administration does not want to hear about trans folks, does not want to hear about gender-based violence, does not want to hear about racial vulnerability. So this is the other opposite, and one of the reasons we're in such dire straits, these funds are being taken away, but they are part of the operating budgets of the universities. We are depending on them. So one can live a life and thinking of critical thinking, but one, I think, also has to be prepared that you will not be successful financially, that
Mhm.
you may not be successful professionally. And this is where one has to take a really close, hard look at one's own goals and intentions because, I'll admit it, I have an ego too. And, it's very disappointing to want to write about these things, but they will never, get that kind of financial backing because these are not happy, pleasant things for people to hear about. So that's the other problem. It's not just familiarity, but it has to be welcoming and non-threatening. So
Right.
to live a life of thinking is perfectly possible. Is it possible with financial success? Maybe.
Uncertain. It's uncertain.
Yeah. I mean, I certainly think everybody who's gotten a grant would say, "Oh, but I do all this important work." So who's going to say no? I'm living a life of thinking, right? But we also have to kind of think about what's not threatening about their work such that they actually got the money for it. Because if it were threatening, they would not have received the money.
Mhm. Mhm. Thank you. Thank you for addressing that uh, kind of complex question. It's a great starting point, at least. So those were the questions that I wanted to ask you. It's really a pleasure listening to you. Anything else that I failed to ask that you'd like to touch on before we conclude? Any current or future projects? I heard about uh, a potential book on dismissal. Is that in the works or?
I don't know. I mean, right now I'm chairing my department, so a life of the mind is very elusive. It's summer where I'm supposed to get time to work and it's not happening. I'm getting time to read, so I'm reading Phenomenology, and I have a book that I've actually had on the back burner for over a decade, actually on white supremacy. I pick it up, I put it down, I pick it up, and really 2012 was when I started this, and I don't think there was a reception for it, and now the ideas feel very old, but I workshopped it to some colleagues at my institution, and the self-described millennials are excited about it. So I'm like, okay, maybe there's something there. And it's really this is why I'm looking at phenomenology because I think I want to talk about the what the comportment, the phenomenological comportment of white supremacy looks like in a collective way. So what does it mean to be part of white supremacy, even when we think that we're progressive or that we're not helping the cause of white supremacy? How do even certain kinds of mainstream attitudes and entitlements um, make us complicit in the in the project of white supremacy? And that is very, very difficult, I think, to hear. It's difficult to write, because many of us who are, for example, not Black may very well be complicit in this, right? And so what does that kind of entitled embodiment look like? It's about culture. It's about norms. It's about saying, oh, but there is the Constitution, and those of us who are progressive in this particular moment, we're now certainly now starting to invoke norms such as the rule of law. But the rule of law, as I write about in the last book, is very discretionary,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
It's not random. It certainly has a lot of biases. And so we kind of recognize it as being just when it meets the goals that we have in mind. But that's also a particular practice of white supremacy, right? What are the goals of justice? And how do we think about this institutionally and juridically? So, we can say, well, these grand juries who are not indicting police officers who were violently, brutally beating Black people, right, in front of cameras with impunity, right? Is it just that they're corrupt, or is it that really this is who the system was designed to support? And so, what are the details of that? How do we think about notions like the reasonable man? How do we think about, the notions such as, what people's intentions are, what certain kinds of ethical standards are? How do we think about the state as something that an institution that is not beneficent? I mean, we see it in a certain kind of administration, right? But if you read Foucault, Foucault also makes the argument that the state is not about justice, that in fact, there's a lot of regulation that is about managing goals, managing outcomes. And I would argue in that sense, the current moment is not as different from previous moments. And that's part of, I think, a larger framing of what we would call white supremacy. I don't think it's restricted to the last 2 or 3 terms of a US presidency.
Mhm.
Right. And so that's the project, is kind of thinking. So I've thought about dismissal. And so, yes, it is part of it, but I'm really trying to think about it now in terms of the actual practices of dismissing, both by institutions, but different kinds of laws, and then also by the way that we engage through our bodies. How do we participate in white supremacy? What are our particular examples of entitlement? So a lot of thinkers have been doing that work. George Yancey has been doing this work. Emily Lee, who's at Cal State, has a book on the phenomenology of women of color. Helen Engo, who has a beautiful book on the habits of racism, which is also about this phenomenology. They're really trying to make these inroads into thinking about this. And so I'm hoping to kind of augment some of their work by thinking alongside them. So that's the current project.
Very exciting. Very exciting. Professor Sheth, thank you so much for your time. It's a pleasure meeting you. Hopefully, we will have future conversations. And I'm hearing that you've been the chair. I'm extra grateful for the time that you took out of your schedule.
My pleasure. It's lovely. Thank you for being interested in my work. Thank you for sharing it with your audience, and my privilege. I'm really grateful. It helps me also think. So thanks, Davood.
Likewise, likewise. Thank you.